Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Anil Seth. Anil is Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex and is a leading expert on the neuroscience of consciousness. He is the editor-in-chief of the journal Neuroscience of Consciousness and is also the co-director of both the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Science and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research's program in Brain, Mind and Consciousness. He has a new book coming out called Being You, which is what we talk about today. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Anil Seth. Anil, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So the occasion of our conversation is that you have this wonderful new book coming out, Being You, and you've been kind of leading researcher in consciousness science for a long time. What led to you writing this book now?
It seemed about time, frankly. I think I'd been having this itch for a while that I hadn't in one place collected all the various things that I'd been thinking over the last 20 years or so that I've been working broadly in the area of consciousness science. And I just got frustrated that publishing papers, individual papers, or even public engagement things like writing the article here and there or giving a talk was only little bits, wasn't the full picture. And part of the reason I wanted to write the book was to get the full picture across, but the other part of it was to figure out, well, what is that full picture? What do I really think? How do all these things fit together? It's only when you try to put things together that you actually realize what the full story is. So it was really educational for me as well to basically figure out what I thought about things.
Yeah, I mean, you've done lots of amazing public engagement work, and I've found it for myself that in doing that work, actually, I tend to come up with new insights, and just stepping back and reframing everything from scratch to a layperson who has no context. I find that really is clarifying. Did you have a similar experience from writing this?
Absolutely, and that generalizes to all the public engagement stuff that I've done. It's something that I'm quite keen to people in my group and people I talk to tell them public engagement is not just about one directional feed of information that you disseminate to the wider public. It's both a two-way thing. I mean, I've learned a lot from dialogues that have been sparked and discussions and collaborations that have been sparked way outside the tram lines of my own neuroscientific research, and also, yes, by trying to explain something in a way that you can get the key points across, it really reveals, firstly, if you don't understand it very well yourself, and it forces you to really get to the core of what it is. And I think that stripping things down is very helpful. It makes it clear when you've just been relying on jargon, whether you've realized it or not before.
Right. And I guess in the spirit of that, of kind of starting at the beginning and stripping things down, maybe if we begin with your definition of how you think about consciousness, just so everyone's up to, on the same page as we go into your thoughts on the topic.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. I think definitions of consciousness are best used to stay on the same page rather than being offered as some real truth or something that any individual is particularly attached to. Partly because definitions evolve. Definitions change as our understanding change, and that's how things should be. So my starting point to ensure that we don't talk past each other is derived from the philosopher Thomas Nagel, which is that for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. There's something it's like to be me, something it's like to be you. There's probably nothing it's like to be a table or a chair or a book or a paperclip. For a bat, maybe yes. For an octopus, probably yes. You get the idea. There are some things for which the status might be unclear, but for a conscious organism, there is some kind of subjective experience going on. That's the key thing. It's not the same thing as intelligence. It's not the same thing as having a self or the experience of being a self. It's the presence of any kind of what in philosophy you might call phenomenal experience. There is something it is like to be a conscious system.
Right. And then you've taken this kind of experimental scientific approach to understanding consciousness, which I think, maybe a good place to go next is the hard problem, because you're kind of intrinsically coming up against that, right? By studying the material basis of consciousness in the brain through neuroscience, there's this famous problem, which maybe you could articulate, but then also your stance of what the real problem is that we should be thinking about.
Yes, I called it the real problem partly as a sort of informal dig at the hard problem, friendly dig at the hard problem. The hard problem has been the modern incarnation of this very old divide in philosophy and in common thinking as well, between mind stuff and matter stuff. A lot of people trace it back to Descartes. The hard problem version of it is due to David Chalmers, a very, very well-respected philosopher of mind. And in defining the hard problem, Chalmers is basically saying that, or driving the intuition that materialist explanations, that is to say, explanations about physical interactions among elements, mechanisms, if you like, will never explain why there's anything like conscious experience at all in the universe. He distinguishes the hard problem from the so-called easy problems. And the easy problems are not easy in the sense of being simple to solve. They're easy in the sense that there is no conceptual mystery, that some kind of explanation in terms of mechanisms is up to the job. So we can think of the brain as a mechanism. It's very complicated, but it's still a mechanism of physical parts and so on, neurons and electrical fields and all this stuff. How does it work? How does it actually transform sensory input into motor output? How does it work as a mechanism? These are easy problem questions. Not easy, but there's no conceptual obstacle there. The hard problem is how and why any of this physical processing should give rise to any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. As Chalmers puts it, it seems unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. We are conscious. We have conscious experiences, though some philosophers will take issue with that and say, actually, we're mistaken about the way in which we think that we have conscious experiences. I take conscious experiences as a kind of given. I want to know, I have an experience which is composed of many different things going on at the moment. There's a difference between being anesthetized and being awake and aware. There's something there. And so Chalmers is really arguing that, or the usual way to interpret Chalmers is that however far you get in solving the easy problems, the hard problem is going to remain untouched and pristine and will be as deeply mysterious as it seems to us today. This may be true. I have some sympathy with this idea that physical explanations will not fully resolve the mystery of consciousness. But I don't think it's a given. And I think dividing the problem space this way into easy and hard problems is not the most productive route to follow. So what I call the real problem is the problem of trying to explain and predict things about conscious experiences, the experiential subjective properties of conscious experiences in terms of mechanistic processes in the brain and body. Think of it as building explanatory bridges between things happening in brains and things happening in our conscious experience. This is not the hard problem because it's not trying to answer the question, why and how is consciousness part of the universe at all? How, what's the magic stuff that generates it from the mechanism? It's not trying to answer that question. And it's not the easy questions either, because we're really not interested just in the functions of mechanisms, but in why is the experience of redness different from the experience of jealousy or the experience of the taste of cheese? These are all different kinds of conscious experiences. They have different qualities, but we can begin to account for those differences in terms of mechanisms. And that's a way to address the real problem. And the hope is, my hope is, and my belief is on good days, that pursuing this line won't solve the hard problem, but it will dissolve the hard problem. That once we have the ability to explain and predict and control why our conscious experiences are the way they are in terms of the brain, then the hard problem mystery just either will seem much less mysterious or won't seem mysterious at all. And the historical analogy for this, of course, is vitalism, that at one point not that long ago, people thought that life could not be explained mechanistically. And now we don't understand everything about life, but there is no conceptual mystery to it being so explicable. Vitalism is not a sort of, it doesn't have currency anymore. The hard problem of life wasn't solved, it was dissolved. It went away when biologists tried to explain the properties of living systems individually and collectively. Life is not the same thing as consciousness, but I think the historical parallel is illuminating.
Right. And you mentioned this idea that the aim of science, you could say, is to explain, predict, and control the phenomenon that you're studying. And in addition to that, do you think that there's any requirement for any understanding of consciousness to be intuitively satisfying? Should we get some intuitive insight into how consciousness emerges from matter, or is that just, we don't need that?
This is a really good question. It's something I've actually been thinking about just today, because I've been writing a piece on panpsychism, which is one of the other big positions in the metaphysics of consciousness, which I don't really subscribe to. Not because it's definitively wrong, I just don't think it's very useful. And so panpsychism is this idea that consciousness is somehow fundamental and or ubiquitous in the universe. And it's a view that's motivated by, in large part, by people thinking that a materialist explanation of consciousness is going to be inadequate. The same motivation that underlies the heart problem. So why would people think that it is going to be inadequate? And I think part of that suspicion is indeed that even if we could explain and predict and control by intervening in the brain in this case, conscious experiences, their phenomenology, their experiential quality to an arbitrary degree of detail, maybe that still wouldn't feel like it's good enough. We're still missing something. We're still missing, like, well, why does it still feel like something to be me? This hard problem mystery might still bug at us. So there are two options. A, in fact, that hard problem mystery will dissolve completely, or it's still there a little bit. And if it's still there a little bit, there could be two reasons for that. One is that, in fact, there's still something we don't understand. There's still a scientific question to be asked, or a different metaphysical stance we have to take. Or it could be, indeed, that we're somehow setting a higher bar for consciousness than we are reasonably entitled to, that it should be intuitively satisfying in a way that we generally don't ask of other scientific enterprises. It's always nice when things are intuitively satisfying. But some aspects of science just aren't. Like quantum mechanics is a great example of a very, very successful science that doesn't even qualify as being intuitively satisfying because nobody can agree what it means. But it works. And it may be incomplete, who knows, but it's doing a really, really good job. And so it may be, but we kind of, well, we care about that, but we don't get too upset about it because it's not us. I think we get more upset about, we want an explanation of consciousness to be intuitively satisfying to a different standard because it is us. And that's just, I think, a little bit unfair on what a science of consciousness should be expected to deliver. Hopefully it will be intuitive, but it might not be.
Yeah, I share your instinct that I agree that panpsychism doesn't really offer a solution, in that you seem to just be saying, well, it's just there. It's just there from the beginning in some way. So you don't really, there's kind of nothing to see here. It's already there. So you don't have to do any chipping away to understand why consciousness exists. And also you also have Mysterianism, right? The idea that it's just utterly beyond our capacities to understand the place of consciousness in nature. And that also seems a bit kind of fatalistic to me, a bit too, taking the hard problem a bit too seriously. And so that's why it's nice that you spending year after year doing actual experimental work, chipping away at this problem, the real problem, instead of taking this kind of very quick solution, right, one way or the other.
That's right. I think there are all these different isms in the philosophy of mind when it comes to consciousness, like panpsychism, we've just talked about a little bit, Mysterianism associated with Colin McGinn. I think if anything is even less appealing to me because it does basically just advocate giving up and going home. It's like all these positions, it's not obviously refutable. You know, there may be things that we humans cannot understand even through incremental methods of building knowledge, like the methods that science gives us. That could be the case. And there are some things that frogs can't understand. That we can understand. There are some things that some humans can understand that I can't understand, many things that humans can understand that I can't understand. But to preemptively include consciousness in this sort of species-specific ocean of ignorance is just not very helpful. It doesn't give you anything to do. And there are actually some people out there, I'm thinking of the physicist David Deutsch, who claims that in fact nothing is in principle beyond human understanding. We've reached some sort of universal level of universal cognitive competence, just as in the same way that once you've got a universal Turing machine, there is nothing that is incomputable anymore. Or rather, all things that are computable can be computed by a Turing machine. Now, I don't know whether that's the case for us and cognitive understanding, but all the same, there is really nothing to be gained from Mysterianism, besides, I think, some valid sort of human modesty that there are things that are complicated to understand. We shouldn't endow ourselves with some godlike ability to immediately grasp everything.
Right. And it's mentioning all these different isms in the philosophy of mind. Would your ism be physicalism or materialism that you'd align with?
Yeah, basically. Although I do treat these things kind of informally and loosely, because I think they're ways of thinking. For me, they're what's the most pragmatic view to take. So I'm not going to rest on sort of philosophical thought experiment type arguments that try to either show that materialism must be the case or that materialism must be false or something else. But for me, it's the most pragmatic way to proceed. We can study the brain as a physical object through the tools of science and the technologies that we have. And then relating that to first-person data about what conscious experiences are like. That gives us something to do. And that's the real problem. That's not a new thing, right? People have been doing this for a long time. It's a large part of psychology anyway. When you focus on the phenomenological properties of perception, like what distinguishes one experience from another, then there are approaches that I've been very motivated by. People like Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson talk about neurophenomenology, which is basically the same thing. How do we relate neural mechanisms to properties of experience? So there's a lot of precedent for this, and you can kind of do this pretty much whatever your metaphysical stance might be, but I think it just aligns most naturally with basic materialist physicalist stance.
Right. And your particular kind of approach to the neuroscience of consciousness, perhaps one of the most famous approaches is the search for the neural correlates of consciousness. But I feel like your research program is slightly different. It seems to be digging a bit deeper in terms of making predictions about what we might observe based on with some kind of theoretical basis. How would you compare your research program to the neural correlates of consciousness research program?
I think it's part of it, but it's sort of an evolution of it. So the neural correlates of consciousness program was historically very, very important. It kicked off, usually identified with people like Francis Crick and Christoph Koch in the early 1990s. And a large part of the historical context there was in the early 1990s. And I know this because I was doing my undergrad at the time and interested in consciousness, but it wasn't being taught in psychology or even physics courses or in natural science, was sort of to push back against the idea that consciousness research is a purely philosophical endeavor or maybe a medical problem or medical issue. that there is a simple experimental approach one can take, which isn't going to give you the answer to the hard problem or to any of the deep problems about consciousness, but nonetheless is useful. You get people, you put them in a brain scanner, you do things like you keep their sensory input the same, but their conscious experience changes. This happens in things like binocular rivalry, when you show two different images, one to each eye. Sensory stimulation remains constant, but your perceptual experience flips back and forth. So you can immediately ask the question, what happens in the brain when your perception changes, but your sensory input doesn't? That would be a candidate neural correlate of consciousness. And since the 1990s, this has been a hugely productive line of work to pursue. And there are still lots of ongoing debates about, are the main neural correlates of consciousness in the front of the brain or in the back of the brain, or maybe even in the brain stem, or maybe all over the place. The cerebellum never gets a look in, by the way. That seems to be forever excluded. But the neural correlates of consciousness, just limited to trying to find strict correlations, is limited, because, as we all know, correlations are not the same things as explanations, nor do correlations establish causal relationships. And so you get these unsatisfying things where, even if we knew that the neural correlate of visual consciousness was in fact in the posterior cortical hot zone and not in the prefrontal cortex, or maybe the other way around, how much have we really learned? We've learned a lot, but we haven't. Just allocating this area or that area is the beginning of a story rather than the end of the story. We want to know, well, why that region? What process is that region involved in? And it's not going to be limited to one region. It's going to be processes spread out across multiple regions. So there's a pressure in general in the neural correlates of consciousness line of work to go beyond correlation towards explanation. And so one way to think about the real problem approach is finding explanatory correlates of consciousness. So it's not arbitrary when you say this process in the brain or this region in the brain is associated with this kind of conscious experience. You begin to have an understanding of why and when, and you can, as you say, predict what an experience might be given some activity somewhere. And as we go towards explanation from correlation, then I think this approach becomes, as you say, it chips away at the hard problem, little by little, more each time we can do something like that. And there are many ways to do this, and the way that I've been advocating for several years now is through, a number of ways, but probably my favorite way is by thinking of the brain as a prediction machine and trying to understand how perceptual predictions that the brain generates, or we hypothesize generates, might account for properties of conscious perception.
Right. And when you're looking for kind of correlations, right, you have variations in consciousness, variations in brain activity, and you're looking how those correlate. And one of the main ways people, I think of consciousness as varying is in some kind of level, right? Some kind of thing where you're wide awake and you're very conscious versus when you're about to fall asleep, maybe you're less conscious, and when you're anesthetized, not at all. This is an area where I'm far more sympathetic to the idea that consciousness might be more of a kind of binary phenomenon, all or nothing. But yeah, what are your thoughts on levels of consciousness?
So indeed, I think that it's important to distinguish here different kinds of correlates that one might go after, whether they're just sort of mere correlates or explanatory correlates. So we can indeed look for the correlates of what you might call global conscious level. As you say, difference between being awake and aware, or under a general anesthesia, or in a coma, or something else. Tempting to think of this as a one-dimensional thing. I think it's probably not just a single dimension. Tim Bain's written about this very nicely. So that's one type of correlate, and the other type of correlate would be the thing we started talking about, which is about conscious content. So for somebody who is conscious, they're conscious of a particular thing, and what is the correlate of that particular scene that they're experiencing at that time. Now, level and content are probably not completely independent, but they certainly lead you to do different sorts of experiments. You put people under a general anesthesia in one case, and you do them something like binocular rivalry in the other case. So for conscious level, this for me, I don't really think of in the prediction machine way of thinking, at least not initially. So that it's something more to do with the global functional integrity of distributed neural networks that can be measured in various ways. So here there's lots of work going back to my old postdoctoral mentor, Gerald Edelman, and his colleague, Giulio Tononi, about the dynamical complexity of brain networks as being key to conscious level. And so for some years now, we've been working on ways to develop measures of complexity that might track conscious level in interesting ways. Whether there's an on-off, like a binary moment of transition, I'm not so sure. Again, I think there could be. It's one of these things that becomes almost a little bit semantic, right? There's again an old philosophical thought experiment or paradox, the idea of when does a pile of sand become a pile of sand, or if you take grains of sand away from a pile, when does it stop becoming a pile? There doesn't seem to be any good point to draw the line until you get down to absolutely no sand at all. So it might be something to do with consciousness. I can imagine that some things really aren't conscious at all. A table, for instance, or me when I'm dead, or hopefully me and under general anesthesia. But that really, it's sensible to think of consciousness as graded for most of the time. That the difference between no sand and one grain of sand just isn't a particularly interesting difference.
Right. I mean, my thinking on this is that what we perceive as change in conscious level is change in contents. And in your book, you said something kind of similar. You said that level kind of blurs into contents. And so, I'm coming at this from the perspective of there are particular kind of ways of meditating where you kind of identify with the witness. You see the kind of common feature of awareness in every conscious experience. And you can have this feeling that core knowingness of consciousness never changes. And there's a particular experience that you can do as you're falling asleep where you can notice that it's the self that appears within consciousness. The contents feel sleepy. Consciousness itself is wide awake. Even at the moment you fall asleep, consciousness feels completely wide awake if you can identify this, just the core knowing aspect. And that I've heard reports of meditators who claim that they maintain consciousness through deep sleep. And I'm becoming kind of increasingly sympathetic to the possibility that the bedrock of consciousness may always be there, even in general anesthesia, but the contents change. So, you go under, you lose your sense of self, your memory processing, you come back out, you feel like there was no consciousness, but perhaps there is the bare kind of lights being on with very little happening may remain throughout. Is that something you think could be occurring?
Well, I hope not in general anesthesia, I have to say. But it's not. I suppose it's impossible to rule out, though. Again, it just becomes a little bit. It's unclear what it might mean to say that there's consciousness without any content at all. There are people who, and you're right to mention the meditative tradition here, because they have notions of pure consciousness, which is in some way completely contentless consciousness. Thomas Metzinger, the German philosopher, has been writing about this much more extensively lately. Is that a particular kind of global state that we can investigate somehow? I think the kind of pure contentless consciousness that you might get in some idealized meditative situation is very different from what's happening in general anesthesia. I think subjectively and physiologically, it's completely different there. So I do think there's an everyday sense in which consciousness goes away in some conditions, such as general anesthesia and coma, in a way that's not identical to simply stripping most contents from our ongoing life. Also, one of the things that makes me think of is it's one thing that stands in the way of doing that is it's very hard to turn off the kinds of internal bodily experiences that we get. The brain is continuously engaged in regulating and perceiving and regulating its physiological state. And it could even be that in some states of external sensory deprivation, or the turning down of our external perceptual awareness, actually that heightens things like bodily awareness. This certainly happens in some meditative practices where you become very aware of what's going on in the body.
Right. And you mentioned the work of Tononi and Edelman and this kind of measuring the level of consciousness by studying the brain. And there's this particular procedure they called zap and zip. I was wondering if you could share that with the audience.
Zip and zap.
Really interesting.
Yeah, so this is a really nice example of consciousness science actually being useful rather than just sort of something, hey, we'd like to understand this because it's one of the big mysteries. There's been and there remains a pressing need to be able to evaluate whether people are conscious in clinical situations. This could be in the everyday manipulation of general anesthesia. You want to know whether it's actually working for that person without overdosing them. And I think more problematically, there are people that have severe head injuries, brain trauma, and end up in conditions like the vegetative state. The vegetative state is different from coma. Coma is kind of unambiguously unconscious, although what you've just said, you might not completely agree. But the vegetative state is confusing because behaviorally, people in it go through sleep and wake cycles. But when they are awake, informally, there doesn't seem to be anybody home. They don't respond to commands. They don't make voluntary actions. Eye movements seem very undirected and so on. So it is defined as a state of wakeful unawareness. And the question then, of course, is, well, just because patients in this condition seem behaviorally unaware, does that mean they're actually unaware, or might they just be unable to express their inner consciousness through behavior? This has been a big challenge in neurology, and there are a number of methods now which try to go by brain imaging data to see whether it's possible to diagnose residual consciousness that is not publicly or behaviorally observable, and the zap and zip method is one of them. So this comes back to this idea that conscious level might broadly be associated with the complexity of neural dynamics. And by complexity here, I mean a process is complex when it sort of hits the sweet spot in between order and randomness, where there's some structure, but not complete regular boom, 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 boom order. And how do you track whether that is happening given some, let's say, brain dynamics that you might measure? Well, you can come up with mathematical constructs that actually try to detect this sweet spot. And that's actually the kind of thing that I've been doing with my colleagues here, like Adam Barrett, for many years now. Another way to do it, though, is to stimulate the brain and see what happens to the brain dynamics after you've stimulated it. It's a bit more, the idea is by perturbing something, you might get a bit more information than just by observing it passively. So what the zap and zip method involves is using a few pulses of transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is TMS. This is a way of injecting a very short, sharp burst of energy into the cortex. And then you use EEG, electroencephalography, to record the echo to that pulse, basically like banging on the brain with an electrical hammer and listening to the echo. And the idea is if the echo kind of wangs around all over the cortex, appearing here and disappearing and appearing there and so on, that's a sign that the underlying brain dynamics are in this sweet spot complex state. But if the response to the echo just stays more or less at the point of the stimulation, even if it's a large response, that indicates a lack of complexity in the underlying brain dynamics. And so this was work led by Giulio Tononi, who we've already mentioned, and his long-term collaborator Marcello Massimini, and now many others as well. And they showed this first nearly 15 years ago in healthy people, that you could distinguish between wake and sleep this way. But now the method has been refined so it actually gives you a number. And this is super cool. Like, you have a number, it's like a consciousness-ometer. And there's increasing evidence that this number gives useful clinical information for people in conditions like the vegetative state. So there have been a few cases where people in that state have appeared outwardly to be unresponsive, but they show the number is called the perturbation complexity index. So they show a PCI value, which is the same kind of value you might get for a healthy control. And in these cases, these are the kind of people that tend to do better and recover, or maybe actually they are already conscious even at the time, which you can figure out in other ways. But the take-home message here for me is like, it's really lovely to see a very theoretically principled measure of conscious level have some traction in the lab and in the clinic.
Right. And the name zap and zip, right, is it right? It comes from, obviously you're zapping the brain, but then the same way we zip kind of files on a computer is to remove redundancy. And if something's more complex, there's less redundancy. So you can use the same algorithm to quantify complexity. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. That's a very fair summary. That's exactly right. It's the same algorithm that zips your digital photos into JPEGs, give or take.
And you've also developed a kind of measure of algorithmic complexity, right, that you can use to study just spontaneous activity in the brain, just doing the zip part without the zap. And is it right that you found that this as a measure of conscious level, it increases under psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, and ketamine, which I think you said in the book hadn't been observed in any other state, right? More conscious level than in normal waking consciousness.
Yeah, that's right. So we had this collaboration with the group at Imperial College London, led by Robin Carhart-Harris, where they'd been collecting unique data sets of high time resolution. So this is magnetoencephalography, high time and good spatial resolution of brain dynamics in a variety of psychedelic states. Ketamine, low dose of ketamine. High dose is actually more like a dissociative anesthetic, but low doses can be quite hallucinogenic, LSD and psilocybin. And so lots of things change in the brain on psychedelics, but we were interested in whether these measures of conscious level, like, as you say, the zip part without the zap, so they didn't do the TMS zapping for these people in the psychedelic state, they just recorded the spontaneous activity. But we'd already shown that even just applying that zip algorithm, which is just basically assessing the signal diversity or randomness of brain activity, that in itself gives you a good blunt measure of level of consciousness. It goes down when you fall asleep, it goes down in general anesthesia, it's lower in things like vegetative state as well. So when we applied that same measure to psychedelic, the data sets from the psychedelic experiments, we found that they went up. So these measures were higher than baseline. Now, this does not mean that neuroscientists discover that psychedelics are a higher state of consciousness. That has so much cultural baggage to be basically meaningless. What we found was that the brain dynamics are more random in this very specific sense of being less compressible in the psychedelic state. Signal diversity goes up. What does that mean? Well, one thing it means is that, as we were talking earlier, there's no sharp distinction between conscious level and conscious contents. And one way to think of the psychedelic state is that it's a wholesale change in your conscious contents. But another way to think of it is that it's such a wholesale change, basically everything seems different, that it's best thought of as a change in your global conscious state or in your conscious level. And so from that perspective, it's not so surprising that we find a measure that's usually been used to track changes in conscious level, like sleep and anesthesia, actually show some sensitivity to the psychedelic state too. And beyond that, I think it's suggestive. There's a bit of an explanatory link you can draw. So if you look at what people report about their experiences in psychedelic states, typical reports are that the perceptual contents they have are a bit more random, a bit more freewheeling, a bit more disorganized than they are when they're not on psychedelics. And so that may, in some very vague way, begin to go along with the brain dynamics being also more diverse and less predictable. And we're digging into that a lot more these days. We're looking at more sophisticated measures of information flow in the brain between different brain regions. And this is work with Lionel Barnett. And with him and our empirical collaborators, we've shown now that there is substantially less information flow between different brain regions in the brain on psychedelics than in the placebo state. And again, this applies to all the three psychedelic conditions that we looked at: ketamine, psilocybin, and LSD. So really the brain is more diverse and destabilized and the patterns of communication between brain regions are massively disrupted in the psychedelic state.
Right. And you were talking at the start about the this kind of neurophenomenology approach of Varela and Evan Thompson, where you have the experience on one side and the kind of objective correlates on the other side, and you're trying to map them together. You write in the book about your own LSD experience that you had relatively recently, I think you say. And did you find that, we've been talking about the objective correlates of the psychedelic experience. Did that give you any extra insight that you could kind of match up to this way of thinking?
It's hard to know. I don't think it didn't sort of deliver new testable hypotheses for me immediately afterwards, but it just seemed to me that like with any kind of reported experience, it's very hard to know what that is actually like. So it's a bit like going back to Thomas Nagel and what is it like to be a bat. I mean, you can say certain things that maybe echolocation might be a bit more like hearing than seeing, or touch than seeing, maybe like some sort of distal form of touch. But the kinds of experiences that people report on psychedelics are so distinctive that I thought that it's kind of necessary for me to figure out what they're like for the first person, so at least I'm not totally misunderstanding the subjective reports that people deliver. But that's in no way saying that my own personal experiences certainly can't have been comprehensive of the range of things that people experience. They may not even have been particularly representative, but they certainly underlined a fact for me that a lot goes on and that perceptual experiences are changed in very, very deep ways and distinctive ways. And so it gave me some confidence that there's something interesting to study here and that we're on the right track.
Right. And so if we turn next to kind of the contents of consciousness and perception, you've spoken a lot about this idea of perception as a controlled hallucination, which I think is an incredibly useful concept. Would you be able to unpack that for the audience and how that differs from our kind of naive realist way of thinking, where we think that we're just seeing an objectively given world out there?
Yeah, so this idea of perception as a controlled hallucination, this is a phrase that I borrowed with thanks and credit from Chris Frith, who's one of my inspirations in London. And he was one of the first people to talk about perceptual experience and its alterations in things like hallucinations and delusions in psychosis as resulting from how the brain makes predictions about the causes of its sensory data. This basic idea is very old. It goes back way before me, Chris Frith, or anybody else who's around at the moment. It traces back to the usual historical anchor is Hermann von Helmholtz in the 19th century. He was the first person to formalize the idea that perception is not just this readout of sensory signals as they come into the brain from the world, and we sort of extract features at different levels of complexity as these signals get further and further in, but it's all basically happening in this outside-in direction. It is in fact happening in the other direction, that the brain is continually making predictions about the causes of sensory signals that it gets. And the sensory signals are just calibrating these perceptual predictions in various ways. They can be thought of as prediction errors that update predictions to tie them to the world in various ways. So this was what Helmholtz described as unconscious inference. He called it unconscious because we are not conscious of that mechanism. We're only conscious of the results of that mechanism. We're conscious of the best guess that the brain comes to about the causes of its sensory inputs. And one way of thinking about why the perceptual system should work this way is that this is basically a way of accomplishing Bayesian inference. So Bayesian inference is a very powerful principle for how to deal with situations that are inherently ambiguous and uncertain. And the relationship between our sensory signals and what's out there in the world is inherently ambiguous and uncertain. So it's not given to us by these sort of sensory signals with labels on. The brain has to infer what's out there based on uncertain information. So a way to do that is by reasoning, instead of reasoning from causes to effects. Bayesian inference involves reasoning backwards from effects to their most likely causes. That's a good way of framing what the problem of perception is all about. It's about the brain reasoning from effects, sensory signals, to their causes out there in the world. And then how the brain actually does this in practice is through this mechanism of prediction error minimization. So having a current best guess about what's going on and then using sensory signals to update that prediction, to try to minimize prediction errors. You continue to update your best guess, and that turns out to be mathematically a way of approximating Bayesian inference. So that's kind of the idea about a way of thinking about perception. I think it's really a powerful inversion because it makes us think that, okay, what we perceive is not some readout of the world. It's really this top-down, inside-out best guess. And the sensory signals are not conveying the content of perception. They're just helping the brain's best guesses keep track of the world in ways that are useful to the organism. So that's why I think it's helpful to think of perception as a controlled hallucination. It doesn't mean that anything goes and what we're seeing is unrelated to the world. No, it means there's a continuity between what we typically think of hallucination, which is seeing something that isn't there, and normal perception. You know, we never see what's actually there. What would that even mean? Kant has told us that. But normal perception is when our perceptual predictions are tied to the world, and when they become untied to the world, well, that's when we typically call hallucination.
Right. Yeah, I think this is a hugely important point. You know, the idea that consciousness is kind of like a simulation that we're using to navigate the world, and that the world out there doesn't look like anything. It doesn't have an appearance. Appearance is something that happens in consciousness, right? Like red things are not actually red out there in the world. What would it mean for it to be red out there? A physicist would have to quantify the level of redness, which isn't how it works, right? And you mentioned Kant, and yeah, the idea of the kind of the noumenon, the thing in itself that can never be known, but you have all this phenomenal experience in consciousness. And also John Locke, right? I think you write in the book as a kind of, this relates to his way of thinking of primary and secondary qualities of the things out there in the world versus your experience. And in my experience, people can be kind of resistant to this insight because it feels so intuitive. I think if consciousness is functioning like kind of healthily, it really should feel like that you're seeing the world out there, right? It seems a feature of consciousness of conscious perception is to imbue our perceptions with a sense of realness. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, this is something I've been thinking about more often. It's why does it seem weird to think that perception comes from the inside out? And one reason is that the contents of perception have this quality that they seem to be objective properties of the world. Most of the time, but not always. There are some times we perceive things and we don't perceive them as being externally existing properties of the world. A good example being if you look at the sun, it's a really sunny day here at the moment. If you look at the sun and then look away, you'll have this, you obviously should not look at the sun. It's not a good thing to do. But if you did, you would have an after image. You'd have this kind of thing that you experience not as something out there in the world, but as a glitch in your visual system. So not every perceptual experience has this quality of realness. And there are other, I think, examples of this, which are also fascinating and maybe harder to pin down. So there are synesthetic experiences. There's some people who, when they, for instance, see letters that may be written in a black ink, they have concurrent color experiences. They'll have an experience of redness that goes along with seeing a specific letter. Now, I'm not synesthetic, so it's hard to be 100% sure, but having spoken to many and done quite a bit of work in this area, it doesn't seem, at least for most synesthetes, that they experience their synesthetic colors as really existing out there in the world as they do when seeing an actual red bus or something like that. So there is this perceptual attribution of reality that I think is useful for us as biological organisms. It's useful to guide our behavior. I mean, what would be the point of a perceptual system that labeled things as being red, but also labeled the redness as not being very real? It would not be a good way to build a perceptual system. If you want these features, if these features are useful to guide behavior, they're going to be more useful if the brain takes them as existing. So that's probably, there's a good adaptive reason why perception works this way. But then I think, as you said, it also, and this is something I do write about in the book a bit, it may be one reason why we are geared to certain intuitions about how perception works that may turn out to be very wrong. This idea that there's a redness out there and we have red detectors and therefore we read out the redness in some sort of inner theater, and that's how red experiences happen. I think that's completely wrong.
Right. And so you mentioned this idea of the brain being understood as this kind of Bayesian prediction machine. And if we try and kind of understand why that should be the case, for me, it seems to, it makes most sense when you think about our survival as a living organism, and that we need to navigate the world and predict what's going to happen as this embodied organism. And you write about Carl Friston's free energy principle as well. Is that for you a nice way to tie those two things together?
Yeah, I see that the free energy principle from Carl Friston is I know that you recently talked to him as well, and he's been a long-term mentor of mine as well. It's a fascinating guy, fascinating ideas. Yeah. And the free energy principle, I don't want to go over the whole thing again. It's a long story, but basically it's you get to something like the free energy principle by taking the ideas that we've been discussing and following their thread inwards to the body. So you can, for instance, once you understand that perception of the world around is this kind of perceptual prediction rather than a readout, the next step is to say, okay, well, what's the experience of being a self all about? The experience of being me. The book is called Being You. So this is ultimately what I want to get to in the book, is what is the experience of being a self? And so the way to think about that for me is that that's a form of perception too. That's another kind of Bayesian best guess. Then the next step is to go inside the body. So there's the body as an object in the world. I have hands, my hands are in front of me. But then there's the interior of my body, the visceral organs, the heart, the liver, the kidney, all these things. And the primary purpose of a brain, if you think about it, is arguably to keep the body alive, to keep our physiological condition adequately regulated so that we continue to persist in this, as Carl would say, out of equilibrium state of being alive. non-equilibrium steady state of living. The equilibrium steady state for something like you or me is a pile of mush on the floor. We persist in these statistically unlikely states. How do we do that? Well, it's not good enough for perception of, it's not just good enough to perceive my internal state and just say, oh, look, I'm turning into mush. No, I have to regulate it. So perception of the interior of the body is fundamentally not about where my internal organs are or what shape they are. It's about regulating the interior of the body. And that leads to a number of interesting consequences, thinking of things this way. Firstly, you can begin to understand why experiences of the body from within have a very different flavor to experiences of the world around me. So, things in the outside world have shapes and colors and things, especially when I experience them through vision, because that's what the visual perception cares about to a first approximation, where things are and what they are. But the experiences of the interior of my body have to do with how well regulation is going. And so I experience things like valence and affect, emotion and mood. And at heart, at the very bottom, this basic sense of being a living organism. And that's where I think, I get to really the end of the story in the book about that's where the roots of being a self are, in perceptual predictions that are geared towards keeping us alive at the very lowest physiological levels. And the connection to the free energy principle here is that it turns out that one way to effectively regulate a system is to have a predictive model. So predictive models of the causes of sensory signals can be used to effectively regulate and control them. This connects to other literatures, as I describe in the book, about cybernetics and control theory and engineering. So we now have a story where we can basically get to the same point from either direction. I mean, Carl calls it the high road and the low road. And I forget which is which, but knowing Carl, I think if you take the free energy principle, it's probably the high road, where you start with some very basic physics-based or mathematical constraints on what it is to exist. And from there, you can derive, okay, so for something to continue existing at some level of complexity, it needs to develop the ability to regulate through predictive models. And then you go from there to the rest of our perception of the world around us. Or you go the way we've been talking, which is the low road, the other way around. You start from insights about how we perceive the world around us, and then you go all the way down to what it takes to continue being a living organism. And for me, this is it's really nice. You have this now through line where you can go in both directions, and hopefully it all lines up. It may not, right? So one of the things that with colleagues now, Chris Buckley and Manuel Baltieri and others, there are things about the free energy principle that may not in fact cash out all the way down. It may not generally apply in the way that it would be nice to think that it does, but that's work that remains to be done. The overall story is that the way we experience the world around us and the self, they're both fundamentally tied to the brain's role in keeping the body alive. And I think that lots of implications of that. It makes us think that there's very close connections between life and mind and consciousness that are less apparent if you, for instance, only study consciousness by looking at visual perception. It's not clear what consciousness has to do with life from that perspective. But now I think it becomes clearer. And that for me is an interesting consequence of these ideas.
Right. And so you have this picture of how it is that a brain generates this experience of being a self. And you write about selfhood and the way that it's not that you are a self and that there's some kind of objective essence that persists over time, right? But more that the self is a perception. And do you think this lends credence to the idea that in meditative and psychedelic states, when people have the insight that the self is an illusion, that is actually something supported by science?
I would say it's consistent. I'm not sure to what degree there's actual support there, but anything that reveals in the first person the constructed nature of selfhood, I think is compatible with this notion that the self is a kind of perception. And it's not just in meditation, it's there are, psychedelics again gives you a state where you can understand the self as quite, you have these ego dissolution experiences where the self dissolves in some ways, but not in all ways. And then, of course, there's a whole raft of different kinds of neurological and psychiatric conditions where experiences of selfhood are altered in quite specific ways. And there's no way to understand all of these things in terms of there being some unitary essence of self. But they do all make sense if you think of the experience of self as a kind of perception, but the sort of perception that's made up of many different things going on at once. So the perception of, back to what we were talking about, the perception of the control-oriented perception of the physiological condition of the body, all the way up to the perception of my social environment and cultural environment. And then in the middle, things like perception of internally driven actions, which I associate with free will and agency, and the experience of having a first-person perspective on the world. All of these sorts of things together construct the normal, everyday experience of being a human self. But we will experience it differently too.
Right. And so with this picture, we're talking about, it's very much a neuroscience picture, right? We're talking about the brain and human experience because that's what we can study. What are your intuitions as to where consciousness exists amongst kind of, in the rest of nature? Is it fully dependent on the nervous system? If an animal doesn't have a nervous system, do you think it's impossible for it to have consciousness?
I don't know for sure, but I doubt it. And there's just inevitable uncertainty here because we just lack a consensus marker of consciousness. So all we can do is reasonably extrapolate from what we take as sufficient mechanisms in humans and, at least for me, mammals. So I think mammals share all the necessary neural equipment to be pretty sure they have conscious states too. This may seem trivial, but of course it's not a trivial thing to say. There are people throughout history who have required that there be a certain level of intelligence or linguistic competence or explicit self-awareness to attribute consciousness to a creature. I think those are all the wrong sorts of criteria. They all stem from a kind of anthropocentrism that we still have, a latent anthropocentrism where we sort of take that which we think of as most distinctive of humans and take that as a sort of basic criteria for something that's take that as a criteria for something that is actually much more basic, which might be the ability to have conscious experiences at all. So the way I tend to think of this is that, yes, all mammals have this necessary equipment for consciousness. Beyond that, it becomes very interesting and largely unknown. You look at, and probably quite varied, and then it becomes like you treat birds as a single problem, but of course there are many different types of birds. Fish, there are many different types of fish. Octopuses, there are many different types of cephalopod. We are always caught between the challenge of knowing that intelligence is not the same thing as consciousness, but nonetheless being tempted to use intelligent behavior as some kind of yardstick by which to attribute consciousness. I think, in a sense, it's informative, but we must always be careful not to equate the two. So I do think you need a nervous system to be conscious. And I don't think any kind of nervous system is sufficient for consciousness either. But exactly where you draw the line is a story that's yet to be told. But where I think this idea of tying consciousness more closely to life takes us is that the circle of species that have conscious experiences may be broader than if you thought about consciousness as some kind of elaborate cognitive competence.
Right. And with that sense of kind of cognitive competence, I guess that takes us to the idea of conscious machines, right? Because we've got artificial intelligence, But given that you have this very embodied view of consciousness, the other extreme would be a kind of functionalist view where it's all to do with information processing, right? And it's fully substrate independent, and you could just instantiate a mind in a simulation. Do you align more with the idea that it wouldn't be possible to do that?
So yeah, this is where the book lands in the end, with a discussion of these fairly topical issues about machine consciousness, and topical not in the sense that I think there's any likelihood that we'll be living among them in the next couple of years, but because there's quite a lot of attention to the development of AI at the moment. And part of this attention in AI is justified, part of it maybe a little bit overhyped. But there is an interesting question there. We can build machines that do smart things now. Will it ever be reasonable to attribute them with conscious states? Now, some people think that consciousness is a sort of function of intelligence and it's substrate independent. So if a machine is made out of silicon, once it crosses some threshold of intelligence, the lights come on, the inner lights come on, and it has experiences. I think there are, as I explained in the book, there are very many problems with that argument. It's kind of interesting why people have that intuition. Not everybody has it, but some people do. The main issue, the unknown issue about consciousness in this context is indeed whether it's something a machine, however sophisticated, could ever have. Is it something that is substrate independent? In a sense, we are machines too, but what I'm getting at is, does the stuff we're made out of matter? Or could we be a silicon beast machine and be conscious? Again, it's sort of impossible to know for sure. I just find some of the assumptions people make in this area as quite unsafe. So there's this idea that consciousness is a form of information processing. This seems to be a statement that people make and just think it's perfectly obvious that that's true. It's just a question of what form of information processing. I don't think this is a safe assumption at all. And of course, I'm not alone in this. There are many others who are skeptical of this idea, that it's just not obvious that information processing is sufficient for consciousness. It's sufficient for cognition, it's sufficient for intelligence, but is it sufficient for raw feeling? Now, the connection that I've tied to life suggests that it might not be. That when you think about the brain's role in regulating the body, there's no sharp distinction between mindware and wetware here. This imperative for self-regulation goes all the way down. So it's not a question of running the right program on the wetware of the brain and that's how consciousness happens. No, it's sort of deeply embedded in the physiology of the system. So I don't think it's a safe assumption that a conscious machine is simply going to happen as AI improves. But I also don't think it's safe to assume that it won't. And here's where it gets tricky. Because constructing a conscious machine is not something that we should be trying to do, I don't think. Certainly not something we should be blindly pursuing. Because if we could generate synthetic consciousness, then we have suddenly introduced things that are moral subjects into the world. We have to care about them. If there's potentially the capacity for artificial suffering, this could be a massive ethical catastrophe. Just setting out to build a conscious machine is like, well, why would you do that? That's not a great thing to aim at without very, very good reason. So even though I think it's really unlikely, the inability to exclude it means that we should pay attention to the ramifications of either deliberately or accidentally succeeding.
Right. Thank you so much for your time. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more?
Oh, thanks for the opportunity to chat, James. I appreciate it and enjoyed it very much. To find out more about these things, well, as we've kind of mentioned a few times now, there is a new book. The book is called Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. and it's coming out in the UK in September, early September, September the 2nd, I think. And there's a lot more on my website, which is anilseth.com. And you can follow me on Twitter as well at Anil K. Seth.
Great.
But lots more there. And yeah, thanks, James. It's great.
Yeah,
great
I'll
chat.
make sure those links are in the description as well. But yeah, thanks, Anil.